Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to convene a special meeting of the Facilities Committee. Today's date is September 19th. It's approximately 11:08, and I would need a motion to approve the prior minutes. Do I have a motion to approve? Motion pushed by Mr. Garrity, seconded by Mr. McDevitt. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. Okay, let's go right to number 3, action, agenda, and new business. And I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Hajos at this time.
Thanks. Actually, I'll jump down to 4 because there's nothing under action agenda items at this time.
Okay.
Under 4 is the referrals. As you all know, we were looking to do the 6-month lease agreement with D&G. Since then, we have put out an RFP, and going further down a discussion, we received 2 proposals back. And if you look through your packet, there's one from D&G and Mr. Finger, and there's another one from Perkins Recycling and Bob Perkins. D&G has a proposal for $501,000, and Perkins has one for $450,000.
Okay, so I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Moore this time.
So this committee a month or 2 ago directed us to do another RFP for the sale of this property. We did one towards the end of last year and resulted in Mr. Perkins being the only bidder. And I believe the bid at that time was $400,000, and the Board of Supervisors ultimately decided not to act on it. I believe we tabled the resolution at the December meeting. We did another RFP in the beginning of the year for either a purchase or a lease, with D&G being the only responder to that. D&G agreed to pay a higher rental rate per month. We have not, that 6-month rate went through the Board of Supervisors, was approved. The agreement has not been executed yet. And we've done that because we knew that the committee wanted to investigate another sale, and we didn't think it was fair to the current tenant to charge the higher rental if the committee was going to go in a different direction with respect to this property. So the rental that's being paid is still the rental with the month-to-month contract. We have not executed the higher rental. This is the 3rd RFP. This is a purchase RFP only, and as the chairman and the superintendent indicated, the bids came back from the 2 companies that are in the room today. Mr. Perkins is over there, Mr. Finger is over on the opposite side of the room. Just so you know, with the way we structured this RFP, and I have a copy of it someplace in my folder here. Is this it? Okay. It's a cash sale. That's at execution. It's as is, so that the purchasers are representing that they are aware of all of the potential environmental issues, etc., on the property. And there will be an addendum filed to the deed if the county sells this property. The county attorney's office worked on that addendum. All the existing easements have to remain in place. Also, back to the financial piece, sorry to jump around, we had a 10% earnest money deposit required to be attached to the bid. Both of the bidders did that. Now let me read to you a couple of key sections on the deed restrictions and covenants which would be attached to this deal. Acknowledgement that this property in the past was subject to contamination. Acknowledgement that the EPA and the DEC have asserted jurisdiction over the property. The grantor, which is the county, would be transferring to the grantee, which is the purchaser, and its successors and assigns all responsibilities and liabilities, and that the purchaser hereby unconditionally waives, releases, acquits, and forever discharges the grantor, Ciba Geigy, Hercules, etc. It's basically when the county agreed to indemnify Ciba Geigy, Now, if we're going to sell this property, the purchaser in turn has to agree to also indemnify the county. Future use of the property shall be limited to industrial use. We have provisions in there regarding any pavement being breached and requirements that we would expect the future owner to live up to. There shall not be constructed, maintained, or used on the property any residence, school, hospital, or other facility that would result in excessive human contact. Shall not conduct any excavation that results in the release of hazardous materials, waste, or other contaminants without taking all appropriate steps to ensure the proper handling, treatment, and disposal of all such materials. The grantee shall indemnify, defend, and hold harmless the county. That these restrictions and covenants shall run with this land and be binding forever on the purchaser and its successors. So this will be on the books in the county clerk's office, always attached to this land. Both of the bidders have read this. It was included in the RFP, have consented to it by virtue of responding to the RFP. Now, both bidders had certain requirements in their bids. I'll go first to the D&G bid, $501,000. One concern was that all of the terms and conditions in the bid proposal are satisfied. That won't be a problem. That's just has to do with the county doing the due diligence and the legal processes that we have to do to transfer the property. The second is a financial contingency. This D&G's bid is contingent upon receiving financing from a lending institution in the amount of at least $450,900. And the third is the receipt of any and all no further action or closure letters from the New York State DEC or any other applicable government agency with respect to any environmental remediation activities required at the property. For the part of the other bidder, Perkins, bid is contingent upon the site being clean according to the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. The bid is also contingent on the site being cleared of any debris. Overhead doors, docks, and baler must be in working condition. Superintendent Hajos has provided information to both of those bidders, hopefully to satisfy those concerns, and I don't know whether we've received anything back in writing from the bidders yet. The bidders are here, and if it's the will of the committee, I suppose we could address that with the bidders as to whether the county has satisfied their contingencies.
Let me just jump in real quick. For Perkins, for the doors and docks, again, I think you stated in the beginning that the property is being sold as is. All the overhead doors do work. There's 2 out of the 5 loading docks that basically the floating part of the dock is not in working order right now.
Mr. Garrity?
They dock locks? Is that what they are?
They're adjustable.
They're the
Yeah, but they're dock locks,
Dock,
right?
yeah.
They hook onto the trailer when it backs in. They're called dock
No.
No, I
No.
don't think so.
They're just,
They're just a floatable dock that'll adjust to the height of trailers, that's all.
Because of the-
There's
yeah,
no
you back
place.
in, you hit it, and it raises you up.
Right.
Yeah, we had them at the minute.
We
Two of them don't work.
What about the baler?
Yeah.
Baler works.
Baler
It's
works.
being used by D&G right now.
Okay, so the first question I'm going to ask is if the 2 bidders are satisfied with the county's position, because if they're not, then obviously we don't need to go forward with that bid. So, Mr. Perkins, I'll ask you first. Are you satisfied with, or Mr. Perkins, excuse me, are you satisfied with the county's position pertaining to your proposal?
Yes.
Okay. And Mr. Fingers, are you satisfied?
Yes.
So both bidders are satisfied, okay, so we can go to the next step. Yes, Mr. Leggett?
And the subdivision is complete for this land?
Subdivision is all complete and filed with the clerk's office.
Yep, that's been filed. So the next step, Mr. Moore, would be what?
Okay, well, we, by county law, which is a state law, it's not a county adopted law, a little confusing, but county law section 215 lays out what the county would have to do in order to sell property. We have to have a competitive process. We have to declare that it's no longer needed for a governmental purpose, and we have to take the highest responsible bidder to participate in that competitive process. The questions that are left to the committee are if you want to take the high bid and declare that bid a responsible bid. We have to address the financial contingency on that bid because, again, this is supposed to be an all-cash deal. And we would like to get the sale done quickly and wouldn't want to be waiting for a long time for that financing to come through. In terms of the second bidder, if the first bidder was not a responsible bidder, you could get to that second bidder, or you could get to the second bidder if the first bid ultimately becomes non-responsive due to the timing of getting the financing together. Does that make sense? In other words, we're bound to the high bid unless the high bidder is declared to be not responsible, or if the bid turns out to be non-responsive by virtue of not having the cash available.
Mr. Loeb?
Thank you, Chairman. Ryan, if I may ask a question about, we have to make a decision of the timing of responsiveness. So the first bidder said contingent on getting the financing.
Yes.
We have to decide how many days. That answer probably should be already available, but then we have to decide, okay, you've got 3 days to get the financing, or
Yeah, it's
or we can
that'll have to.
work completely.
That would have to be. I would suggest if you're going to go with the first bid that you attach a time frame to it, and the Board of Supervisors is going to have to approve what that time frame is going to be.
Mr. Garrity?
Yeah, well, what were our terms, though? What was the terms? It be paid immediately?
The terms are. I'll read it to you from the RFP.
So, I mean, why do we wait?
That's my question.
Don't jump on my parade.
No jumping in front.
No, I mean,
You just give me a minute. I'll find
Okay.
that piece.
now you can go ahead.
If I may.
Yeah, I'm gonna wait until Mr. Moore finds that.
No, go ahead. It might take me a
Oh,
minute.
Okay. Mr. Wild, then Mr. Sokol. He was.
Sokol may go first.
Mr. Sokol, then Mr. Wild.
Jump in there.
He's a jumper.
Well, you know, if I were going into buying a business, I would have my ducks all in a row. I mean, my concern is that there has been time already to get the funds for this, and here we are, ready to make a decision on the committee level, but the funds aren't there. We have another bidder, the funds are there. So, and I'm not comfortable with this.
Okay. Mr. Moore?
So the balance being so I indicated that both of these bidders put up the 10% earnest deposit certified check. So the balance, the 90% balance, shall be received by the Treasurer's Office in cash or certified funds on or before tender of the deed of conveyance by the county.
Mr. Wild?
Chairman, thank you. Could we find out whether this financing has been secured? I haven't heard that it has or has not been.
We could ask that question.
I'd be more than happy to ask that question. Mr. Fingers, has the financing been secured?
Yes, it's going to be taken care of by TD Bank. I've met with them. I don't have a commitment letter in my hand, but the meeting I had with them went quite well. I don't see any problem coming up with financing unless you're going to close today.
Okay.
So just as a follow-up, how much time do we think is reasonable, or how much time does he feel he needs to get that secured? I
Correct.
think that's important for our decision today.
Correct, Mr. Wild. Mr. Fingers?
I would say 1 week.
Okay, so you're saying that in 1 week you'll have a commitment letter of your financing for $450,900. Committee, thoughts? Mr. Leggett?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With the price difference between the two bids, I do think it is, we're better stewards of taxpayers' money here if we do give sufficient time for the securing. You know, if we're talking just a matter of, say, 2 weeks to know one way or another.
Okay, Mr. Simpson, did you have your hand up or no? Okay.
No, but I do have,
You do now, okay.
okay, yeah, no, I was thinking, I just was,
Okay.
thinking. If, now, we heard verbally that it would take about a week. If we determine that it's, a week, that we have some kind of concrete commitment, if that doesn't happen, is there a, I mean, does it just go away? Is there any kind of, because I know...
If it doesn't happen, then he's not considered, I guess, a responsible bidder, and we go to the next bid.
Responsive.
Responsive, excuse me.
Responsible
Excuse
is in
me.
reference to things like pollution.
Right. A responsive bidder, and then this committee would decide whether they wanted to go to the next highest bid, which would be Mr. Perkins. Yes, Mr. Wild?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm curious about the arrangement we have with our deposits. So if we were to say, let's give him a week to make that financing happen, if he doesn't secure that, does the deposit get refunded, or is that something that we keep?
No, we don't keep a deposit. We'll only keep a deposit for when the property is transferred over. If the county does have the right to reject all bids, and when the county rejects a bid formally, that's when we would refund the 10%. Those checks are in a safe in the treasurer's office right now.
Ms. Bramer?
Thanks. Why wouldn't we deposit those to make sure they clear?
They're certified checks.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Diamond?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ryan, just refresh my memory, when did these bids go out?
I believe 4 weeks ago,
4 weeks ago.
August
And
28th.
To Mr. Sokol's point, I have to agree with his logic in regards to that these two competitive bidders have plenty of opportunity to secure the financing. We have a situation here where Mr. Fingers has said that he had a conversation with TD Bank and it went well. Well, if I was to buy a piece of property, I would want to bring that to a meeting and a document that I was going to have the financing. The other thing that concerns me is that Mr. Perkins is here today, and I believe he's prepared to write a check to the county today for $450,000. What's at risk is the potential of the timeline for Mr. Perkins. I don't know what his position is, I haven't talked to him about it, but here's the way I'm looking at it, is that if in fact he has a timeline and we try to fast track this forward, because he's selling a property, he needs to have a building available to move into to continue to run his operations. If for some reason that this process that we're extending to Mr. Fingers, who does not have that commitment letter, which he should have had today to bring to the county, if that extends beyond Mr. Perkins' needs, what happens to our position here? He walks out the door, takes his $450,000 and says, I can't, I've got to go find another building, and then Mr. Fingers comes back to us and he can't secure bank financing. What's our option? Continue to lease with Mr. Fingers? I mean, personally, I'm not going to walk away from $450,000 simply because I don't want to extend the county's debt to buy this building. I don't want to use fund balance to buy this building. I'll take my chances with the $450 cash today in regards to this proposal.
Mr. Moore?
It's a valid point. As I mentioned in the beginning, if you are to go with the high bidder, I would strongly suggest that you also have a provision in the resolution authorizing us to sell to the second bidder if the financing is not in place by a date certain. But that said, I don't know if that's a tenable position for the second bidder, as Supervisor Diamond just brought up, which is a good point. Maybe the second bidder doesn't want to wait and just wants to move on.
Mr. Loeb?
Everything's been said, it's I'm in total agreement with. Going back to Supervisor Leggett, far as being stewards of the tax dollars. The number that came out was in 1 week's time. Well, on a compromise, next Tuesday is our next facilities meeting, 9 o'clock in the morning. I would offer that we allow the time between now and next Tuesday, when we meet as facilities, to give D&G the opportunity to get that written approval from the bank.
Other thoughts? Ms. Framer, and then Mr. Garrity.
I'm feeling hesitant that the first bidder didn't come to the committee today with the written commitment letter. And the bid's been out there for a while. The bid is from a week ago. So I guess I'm with Mr. Sokol and Mr. Diamond.
Mr. Garrity?
No, I feel the same way. I mean, that's why I want to know the terms of the sale. It's supposed to be a cash sale, so you should better prepare. No? Not a cash sale?
It says at closing.
At
Yeah.
closing, but
He could get the cash before closing and still be responsive.
I can't hear you.
I said he could get the cash before closing and still be responsive. So I just want to be very careful about saying that he's not responsive.
Mr. Wild?
Can I ask our attorney to clarify what being very careful means? So there's a consequence. So you're saying we may not be able to declare this as being not responsive because it doesn't have the financing today?
Correct. Doesn't mean that he's the highest responsible bidder. It just means he was responsive to the RFP. Responsive and reasonable bidder are different.
But we could always accept the other bid because the financing isn't available today. And it's been 4 weeks plus a week since the bids were opened and confirmed that he was the highest bidder.
I would be uncomfortable with that because it gives him until closing.
There are two legal ways not to take the high bid. As I mentioned, you can declare that the high bid is not responsive. You can declare that the high bidder is not responsible. Responsible refers to, again, the uses of the property, if pollution, any qualitative concerns that you would have. Responsive, if you were to take Mr. Loeb's recommendation, we would put in a resolution tomorrow that we are going to declare the bid not responsive if we don't receive a commitment letter by a date certain. So that.
Ms. Bramer?
Well, I would say, couldn't we declare it not responsive if he's not just that he has a commitment letter, but ready to close in, 3 to 5 business days?
In terms of actually having the cash available, the check available?
Yeah.
That's the discretion of this committee and the board.
Well, and maybe the attorney's office too, being able to prepare the closing documents and...
What's the timeline?
So is your question, Ms. Bramer, for Mary about the timeline to actually close? Mary, I'll let you answer that.
I think a timeline of a week to close on this type of purchase would be impossible.
So,
Possible, did you say?
what would be a more realistic closing time frame, would you say?
I would say at least 2 to 3 weeks.
2 to 3 weeks. Okay. Other comments, Mr. Wild?
Chairman, thank you. Another question for Mary. Mary, what would be the least reasonable time for us to put a deadline on securing financing?
I mean, that's up to the committee. I just want to caution you on using not responsive. That's the only thing I want. I mean, it's not up to me to give you advice on when you want to close. It's up to me to tell you if you say he's not responsive and he is, we could be sued for that.
And let me follow up, just from a business perspective. Business can be nasty. I think some of us know that, some may not. But it's in my experience, this could be a play, knowing the timeline, as Mr. Sokol mentioned and others have mentioned, knowing that you can't get the financing, but it could basically remove the option for Mr. Perkins to buy. And then all of a sudden we get to that same situation where we're just possibly leasing, which is, that's a risky situation because we have no idea how long that lease might go on. We might say 5 years, but who knows how long you can keep that business going for 5 years. It could be 20 years, it could be 2. So I just think that there's some risks that we need to take into account here.
Let me ask Mr. Fingers, do you feel comfortable, or can you guarantee this committee that you'll have the financing by next Tuesday at our next facilities meeting?
Based on the conversation I had yesterday, I would say yes. Do I have it in my hand? No.
Okay. Yes, is it, what's your name again, sir?
My name is Mark Ream. I represent Mr. Perkins.
Okay, thank you.
Just some clarifications here. When we're speaking of financing, there's a huge difference between a commitment letter and being prepared to close. So just to disclose that, there needs to be a title search, a title insurance for the bank, and we don't know what the terms are within the commitment letter. It may be that the environmental issue and the amendment and adjustment that's made to the description of the deed may be looked at rather closely by a lender, just from my experience. So it's something for the board to think about. Just because somebody has a commitment letter doesn't mean it is financed for that price and in the condition that it is in. That's up to the lender. So I think, to be fair to Mr. Perkins, to grant a week to have a commitment or assurance from the bank, to me doesn't, it's unfair to Mr. Perkins with a bid. He's ready to pay this, and has been ready, and it's even come up from his prior bids to a price that he's willing to pay right now.
Thank you, Mr. Ring. Mr. Loeb.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question for Mary. 2 to 3 weeks to close. When does that clock start? Is that from this moment, or is that from the time that we approve a particular party?
Well, I mean, the 2 to 3 week timeline is just thinking next week we have committee meetings, so I have to be able to actually draft the documents and do everything that needs to be done to be closed. So that's just my own internal timeline for you.
When would you start that clock?
If the committee passed it today, I would probably start working on it.
We passed it on Tuesday. If we gave D&G till Tuesday, if we gave it till Tuesday, then the clock would start then. You can't start drafting and closing until you have someone to sell it to.
I mean, if I knew that the committee was going to vote to sell it, I could start the documents. I mean, it's the same property, it's the same tax map parcel. There's just some things I couldn't fill in.
All right, that answers the question.
Time-wise, our hope is to get the board to authorize us to sell the property tomorrow.
Other board member questions? You got one, Ron?
Yeah, I do.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So the bid specs requested a bid that effectively an all-cash deal. Bid specs were an all-cash, I think it's referred to as an all-cash deal. And if I understand Mr. Ream correctly, they responded with an all-cash deal. The other one is a contingency offer, which is not an all-cash deal. So I understand that correctly. And let me ask the following question. The deposit was not, if I heard correctly, is not a, it's a sincerity deposit, it's not a bid deposit. It doesn't forfeit should you not move forward with the closing.
No.
It's not a forfeit situation. So, so in effect, what that was doing was simply attempting to represent that the bidders have some financial capacity.
Correct.
No forfeiture. So it's not a bid or a performance type of, it wasn't structured in a bid or a performance way. Do I understand that correctly?
You do.
I have to clarify.
Mary, yes, she wants to clarify something?
I do need to actually clarify. When you ask me about the closing, I guess it depends on who we sell to. Because if the committee ends up selling to Perkins, we have to evict D&G, which means we could write the letter on Monday after the board meeting, but we need to give him until the end of October to actually be out. So we couldn't really close until November.
Ms. Bramer, do you have a question?
I did. I wanted to know if Mr. Fingers had gotten a title report and title commitments.
Would you like to ask Mr. Fingers that question? Okay, Mr. Fingers, would you like to answer that?
Once again,
The title insurance report, or title insurance commitment that might be needed by the financing organization.
I haven't gone anywhere other than place the bid.
Right.
I didn't know I had the bid until last Thursday. Okay?
So, Mr. Ream, you have a
Yes.
statement?
Just one last bit of information. If the board does consider, which I hope it does not, giving additional time for a commitment letter, I believe that Mr. Perkins should also be allowed at the time when any commitment letter is reviewed to provide proof of funds showing that we can close right now. That would give the board a clear picture of where we are. He's ready to go right now, but we want to have that opportunity. So, like I said, it's my preference to have the board decide now, but Mr. Perkins should be included in this because he is ready, willing, and able.
Okay. Mr. Leggett, and then Mr. Perkins.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ream did bring up a good point here. The Perkins bid is saying that we can do this. Now we have the cash, but is there any guarantee of that? How do we know that for a fact?
Mr. Perkins, you may reply.
Give me a half an hour to get down to Bay Street and I'll bring you back a check.
Those coffee cans? Mr. Simpson, okay. Thank you.
Chairman, I say we take him up on his offer.
Digging up the
Close.
coffee cans.
No, I mean, close.
Close. All right, so the way I read this is, the first question is, because we have a current lease, do we want to sell D&G? So I'm going to just take a hand vote on that. It's a non-binding hand vote. So all in favor of actually selling, yes, Clark?
Selling the building.
Selling the building.
The principle is selling the building.
Just selling the building.
Just selling the building, that's the
Not-
first thing I want to get out there. So do we have it, so let's do a roll vote on selling the building.
Means subdivision.
Yes.
The whole
The lot,
property of
the
it.
lot with the building.
The lot with the building, correct.
So what we're taking a vote on is to declare
I
that
just want to make
surplus.
sure we're all clear that, or maybe we don't want to sell. Maybe people still want to lease, so I want to make sure that gets out there clarified.
Sure.
So, raise your hand if you want to sell the lot and the building. Okay.
Mr.
So
Chairman,
that-
can I have a
that's
motion that we
Okay, well-
declare this surplus property?
The wording would be no longer necessary for public use.
That's what I was trying to say.
Do we need a motion for that?
Yes, that'll have to be part of a resolution to sell the property.
Should we do that next? Because it was the majority of the committee to sell the building and the property. So do we now need to declare it surplus?
It's, the wording is, it's no longer necessary for public use.
Or do you need a motion for that?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
can we,
Yes.
I don't think we've effectively
Wasn't, you know...
came to the point of that some people that don't want to sell, okay? If you just
Okay.
give me 30 seconds,
Sure.
okay?
Fine.
I believe it's in the long-term interests of Warren County to lease, not purchase or sell to any member. The words stewards of taxpayer dollars have been spread around here this morning, and the long-term financial, economic interest of Warren County are best served by leasing. The reason people, accrue significant wealth in this world, worldwide, is they lease, they continue to own, and that is my position, and I think it can be validated to take all of the expenses, the roof, the this, the that. that long-term leasing is indeed the more appropriate and economically most viable position to take.
Thank you, Mr. McDevitt.
I want to second Mr. Wild's motion.
Mr. Simpson would like to second Mr. Wild's motion to declare this as surplus.
No.
No longer needed for...
No longer necessary.
for public use.
Okay, so that is a motion. There is a second. So, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Opposed, Mr. McDevitt? Okay. Mary is suggesting an executive session for the purpose of...
Discussing the sale of real property.
Want a motion?
I don't think we need a motion on that to decide. We do need a motion? Okay, motion to go into executive session to discuss the
Sale of real
sale.
property.
All in favor of going to executive session?
Aye.
Opposed? I'm opposed. For the record, I'm opposed. Okay, we're going to go to executive session.
Authorized by this committee.
Okay, we're now officially out of executive session. Nothing was...
We took no action.
We took no action in executive session. I'm now going to turn it over to Mr. Moore.
I believe if there's we would need a motion to proceed with awarding the contract to the highest responsible bidder, who the committee determined to be Mr. Perkins. And we also need to do the seeker, and we need to rescind the past resolutions of the Board of Supervisors approving the 6-month leases with D&G. Have I caught all of that?
So step one would be to rescind the 6-month lease.
We could do it all in one resolution.
Okay.
And we already have this committee's approval to put into that resolution that it's no longer necessary for public use.
Mr. Simpson?
I'll make that motion.
Mr. Simpson makes a motion, second by Ms. Bramer. Discussion? Ms. Bramer?
I just wanted to note that some of my concerns about past practices of D&G and our knowledge of past practices of Perkins weighed into my decision-making on who was the highest responsible bidder.
Okay, thank you. Any other discussion, Mr. Lowe?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could we have an elaboration on why we think Perkins is the highest responsible bidder?
Because this RFP was about an as-is, where-is sale, cash sale, and having a financial contingency in the mix with all the environmental issues that this property has, and the requirements in the RFP that the purchaser indemnify the county, that we're taking a risk that no bank in the world is going to put up the money for this.
Thank you.
Yes, Ms. Bramer?
Thanks. Another thing that's going through my mind is that we do have in there, if I'm not mistaken, in the addendum, that they will comply with certain requirements about not breaching the soil and keeping it paved over, and that is weighing on my mind about which entity long-term can comply with that to keep our risk of liability as low as possible. And I think that that would be Perkins long-term.
Mr. Stroud, you want to say something?
Yes, I mean, we had that property appraised at $665,000. That's the value of the property. So I think it's rather short-sighted in terms of getting, $85,000 a year is generated in rental income. on behalf of this committee and perhaps the board thereafter, to accept a bid that is over $200,000 less than the appraised route. So, so I'm opposed to going forward with this measure, which is including rescinding any previous approvals. And I'm going to be opposed to the sale of this property to either party. Both are underbid from its appraised value. So.
Mr. McDevitt?
I think Mr. Stroud brings up an excellent point. I mean, do we have an appraisal? Isn't that common business practice to get an appraiser to go out there? Wouldn't that be the first step in terms of this process? Yeah, $200,000 less.
115.
215. And what was stewards of our tax dollars? I don't think so.
I'm going to open this up to Mr. Perkins at this time. He had a question or a statement.
I'm going to have to put about 350,000 in there. I got to move my scale down there. The scale house is completely ruined. It's been leaking. I don't know how many years. They don't use that. It's got to have a $100,000 roof on it. So what I'm offering and what I'm spending on it is going to be more than your $600,000.
Mr. Stroud.
I'm putting that in the property.
I would just like to point
Thank
out
you,
the
Mr.
appraisal is based on the current condition of the building.
Okay.
Okay, any other discussion on this? So would you read back the motion, Amanda, so that we're all on the same page here?
Yep, what I have is the motion is to award sale to the highest responsible bidder, which is Purchase Recycling, and rescinding past resolutions authorizing 6-month leases with the
And finding that the property is no longer necessary for public use.
That was a separate
Mhm.
motion.
Oh, we did add a separate motion.
And what would we add on seeker?
We'll do the seeker at the board meeting tomorrow, and based on that determination, we'll pass the seeker part of it.
Okay.
Okay, so at this time, we've gone through the discussion phase. I will call the question. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Opposed.
Opposed, I'm opposed. So opposed is Mr. Loeb, Mr. McDevitt, Mr. Stroud, Mr. Beatty. Okay, privilege of the floor, Mr. Fingers.
I want to make sure I read the original bid properly. The county anticipates that the title is marketable, long paragraph. Successful bidders shall be required to provide an earnest money deposit of 10% at the time of the opening, which was taken care of. With the balance being received by the treasurer's office in cash or certified funds on or before the transfer of the deed. Was that today, or I didn't know? On or before the transfer of the deed by the county. What am I missing there?
The committee, in deciding the highest responsible bidder, made the decision that our ability to have a certified check in hand in a half hour for the balance of the purchase price met the conditions of this RFP, as opposed to the possibility of financing not coming through.
Okay, I think that covers our meeting today. Motion to adjourn? Motion to adjourn by Mr. Garrity, second by Mr. Stroud. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Passed. We're adjourned.